There's recently been a politician claiming that a party switching the candidate after the primaries is unconstitutional. So I think we need a quick refresher on what the Constitution does, or rather does not say, about primaries. It says that states run elections. The timing of presidential elections is determined by Congress. There's nothing in there about parties, primaries, or switching candidates after one steps down. Feel free to read it, especially if you're running for Congress or president. The Constitution left a lot for the states to work out, but there are two main things that we need to solve. How do the candidates get on the ballot, and how is the best candidate chosen from those listed on the ballot? Well, we started off strong. No political parties. We elected one president that way. Then we started choosing from party nominees for presidential elections. The early presidential nominees were chosen among congressional caucuses. It later shifted to a broader group of party leaders and donors choosing from candidates at conventions. In the early 1900s, states and parties started implementing primaries. Some of these primaries were essentially just to poll the public for party leaders to know who could win. Other states implemented a direct nomination of candidates to be on the ballot for the general election. This system also started to be used for nominees to congressional, state, and local offices. At this time, the southern states used primaries to effectively have white-only elections. Those states were for the most part controlled by the Democratic Party, which only allowed white voters in the primary. White-only primaries were later ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in Smith v. Allwright in 1944. In 1968, Hubert Humphrey was nominated by the Democratic Party despite not entering or winning a single primary election. This eventually led to every state adopting a primary election. Today, nearly every nomination for every office is decided with a primary. So our system has changed and evolved over time, but it seems like it's been getting better. It feels like we, the people, get more say over who's on the ballot. Yet this system doesn't seem to be working. Here are some reasons why. 1. Participants aren't as concerned with broad appeal. It is odd, but when we had a system of elected officials and party donors choosing nominees, they had an incentive to find more broadly popular candidates. Their careers and investment could be wasted if they lost. 2. The current system excludes independents and third-party voters. Over 40% of voters are registered as independents. Despite this, many states don't even let this group vote for one of the two major political parties in the primary. 3. It creates a team dynamic. Having party registration and early involvement in the process has led to people personally identifying with parties. They say things like, "I'm a Democrat," or "I'm a Republican," instead of "I am voting for a Democrat," or "I usually vote for Republicans." Partisanship is now the largest divide in the United States, and I think we can all see the negative effects it has on our political discourse. People are more worried about defending their team instead of actually discussing specific issues and trying to find common ground. 4. It creates a state power imbalance. The parties choose which states go first in the presidential primaries, which determine the momentum for presidential candidates. Early states also get an economic boost from the candidates campaigning heavily in them. 5. It creates non-competitive elections. In areas that lean heavily towards one party, there is often no competitive challenger. Incumbents rarely face legitimate challenges from within their own parties, and the other party often doesn't have enough support to be able to flip seats, especially with the amount of gerrymandering that we have. 6. We have surrendered control to the parties. Yeah, it feels like the government is running the system, but look at what happens when the state tries to go against the wishes of the party. They threaten to not count the votes of that state in the presidential primary. We'll see how New Hampshire's ongoing battle with the Democratic Party will play out in the next few election cycles. But the Constitution actually talks about states choosing when elections should be held. Yet parties have been able to bully states into holding primaries on certain dates. I think this is yet another example of how far we've gone from the original intent of the system. 7. And finally, the states pay for it. This is the final cherry on top. We have a system set up by the parties to carry out their interests, yet the states are footing the bill. So can this be fixed? Well, actually, yeah. If you remember where we started, the Constitution said that this is the responsibility of the states. I'm not going to address presidential elections for this video because they are a little more difficult to fix, and despite the amount of attention they get, presidents don't actually control everything. Now I want to go back to those two questions that the states need to address for effective elections. How do the candidates get on the ballot? And how is the best candidate chosen from those listed on the ballot? To determine who gets on the ballot in the general election, we want a process to be decided by the voters, not donors or parties. We want to give candidates with any political ideology a chance to be considered by the voters. However, this isn't a general election. It isn't about finding the most unifying candidate. We simply want to narrow it down to a few of the most popular candidates. The solution to these goals is the nonpartisan blanket primary, also known as the nonpartisan primary or a jungle primary. In this system, there is no party involved. All the candidates are listed on one ballot, and the candidates who receive the most votes get put on the general election ballot. This system is not a new invention though. It's already used in Washington, California, and Alaska. Washington and California are a little boring. They only allowed the top 2 candidates to move on to the general election. Alaska is great though, because Alaska doesn't like the 2 parties, so they let the top 4 candidates move on to the general election. This has gained real traction too. There are actually 6 states with initiatives pushing for some version of this system. Okay, so we have a partyless primary system that decides how candidates get on the general election ballot. Now we need to answer the second question. How is the best candidate chosen from those listed on the ballot? Today, we use the first past the post system. Basically, everyone votes for one candidate and the candidate that gets the most votes wins, even without a majority. The problem with this system is that it creates a spoiler effect, and you already know that. Anytime an independent or third-party candidate is in a race, everyone talks about it taking more voters away from one candidate than the other. They don't talk about the policies or the character of the third candidate. They simply use the fear of people losing to their least favorite candidate in order to get them to suppress their true favorite vote and fall in line behind a major party candidate. We have a few options to replace this system. Ranked choice voting, which works by allowing voters to rank the candidates in the order of their preference. When the votes are counted, the first preference is used. If no candidate gets above 50%, then the votes of the least popular candidate get changed to the second preference of those voters. This is repeated until a candidate gets above 50%. Approval voting, which simply allows people to vote for more than one candidate. Whoever gets the most votes wins. The last option is the star system. This is sort of like approval voting, except instead of just voting approve or disapprove, you give each candidate a score between 0 and 5. The system first adds up the stars for each candidate and ranks the candidate by their total. Then, the top 2 candidates are selected for an automatic runoff. In the runoff, the candidate to score higher than the other candidate on the most ballots will win. The combination of a nonpartisan primary with any of these 3 options is when we can really see some significant changes to the way we select our leaders. This system would lead us away from political parties being so core to our identities. It would allow us to discuss different problems honestly and not feel like we're losing the tug of war between the 2 major parties. So it may be a big change to the system, but I believe the bigger change would be ourselves.